Hello and welcome to Jay Hutch and Anders Get Canceled. So no, this will be. I think that this will be a good one to do. But we are probably talking about. I think we're talking about two sort of hot button topics tonight, and so we're doubling down on the danger. But I think that it'll be fun to talk about these things, and I'm especially happy that I'm getting the chance to talk about them with Anders, who is back for his fourth appearance on Jay Hutch Talks Too Much. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. And tonight we won't be talking about movies.
No, we're not talking about movies tonight. So yeah, Anders has been on the show 3 times to talk about Bicycle Thief. Oh my God, I just put this together. I never noticed that Thief was in the first two, the titles of the first 2 movies. Bicycle Thief and A Christmas Carol. Tonight we're talking about things that, so it kind of makes sense because whenever Anders and I hang out, we tend to talk about movies and we tend to talk about politics. So I think that this will work out in that way. But I'm glad you're here, Anders. I was just also thinking, if you're in one more before I reach 25 episodes, I think your status upgrades. I think you get. Okay. I think you might get co-host status at that point. No. But how are you doing? How are things going?
Good. Teaching. We're nearing. I teach at the University of Waterloo, and as do you. And we're entering already the final leg of the winter term, which is hard to believe this year. I guess I feel it's like it's going by very quickly, and yet a lot has happened, I'd say, in the last 2 months.
Yeah, it sure has. And we've just gone back into the classroom for the first time in 2 years. And so actually, this is the first podcast I've done since going back into the class, which I didn't take into account when I decided to put this together. But I did two 1.5-hour classes today. Probably do this for roughly 1.5 hours tonight.
I did the same thing.
Yeah. So we're maybe not firing on all cylinders, but it'll be good. So also just a reminder, Anders is with Three Brothers Film, which is a website, but also Three Brothers Filmcast, which is a great film podcast. So I do urge you all to check that out because they're doing, Anders and his brothers, Anton and Aaron, are doing great things over there. So yeah, absolutely. So, what I wanted to talk about tonight is nuanced political views. And considering when I took 2 weeks off, I thought, what's going to happen in those 2 weeks? And then everything went crazy. So, the protests in Ottawa were happening before, and I did a podcast on that already. But then, of course, the Emergency Act was put into effect. And then, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened. So I wanted to talk about those 2 things. And I do want to sort of talk about it because it does seem to me that I have, and I know this is true of Anders as well, just based on our conversations, that, we have lots of views on things that, in one sense aligns with one particular group, but in another sense, part of our views don't align with that group. And I think that I find it oftentimes quite difficult sort of to express my full point of view on things because I do think that sort of one side makes sense and the other side doesn't. So the points that I put up for this episode were that, I was sort of ideologically opposed to not the protests in Ottawa existing, but I was opposed to, I think, their point of view, what I could glean as being their point of view. But I also object to Trudeau using the Emergency Act as a way to end them. And as I also said, and we'll get to this point later, I think, but obviously the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is an illegal war crime. In the same sense that the invasion of Iraq was an illegal war crime. At the same time, I think it's worth reflecting on some of the things that led up to this moment, like, for example, the expansion of NATO, and what effect that had in terms of the political atmosphere of that region. So, it does seem to me that, in these topics, you sort of have to choose one and not talk about the other. I don't know. What are your sort of, just beyond the actual issues itself, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that that's totally an interesting topic and something worth engaging with. In part, I think the question of nuance is a challenging one. We live in a soundbite era. If television, cable, 24-hour cable news was one thing, Twitter's another thing, right?
Yeah.
We're also, I think it's clear that we're in the midst of what has a long-term, like, whether you want to put it back to 2016 with the Trump election and Brexit, or you want to push it back to 2008 with the financial crisis, or even further back to the 9/11 and the war on terror, the breakdown of the sort of post-Cold War unipolar rule of liberal democracy as like uncontestable in some ways, both domestically and abroad, right? That's something that we're dealing with here, and these are complicated things because I think we live in a very ahistorical society, a society that doesn't think historically, doesn't think in that way. And the other thing, I guess I would want to turn a question to you. So I think nuance is a interesting thing to talk about, because people sometimes get accused of nuance as muddying the waters, as trying to throw off being, in one sense, being pinned down to a particular position. But I think, would you agree with me that to be nuanced is not the same thing as being per se heterodox?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. But how would you see the distinction between the two of them?
Yeah, I guess I would say nuanced is it doesn't, like you said earlier, like that you generally fall within a particular political framework. I'm assuming, like me, that you would had for many years consider yourself part of the left, as we might understand it, and yet, I'm kind of uncomfortable with giving up that term to people like post-left, or to allow others to dictate what that means. At the same time, that recognizing that left-right as a sort of polarity for guiding discussions around issues, whether it be the issues of vaccine mandates, protest, civil unrest, or war, are hardly transhistorical or universal categories that actually make sense in that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where I'm torn. Like, I think there are probably some things where people might label me as heterodox, right? It maybe on even the issues surrounding the pandemic and things like that.
Right.
There might be and around war, but to me with the war thing, it seems very uncontroversial for someone who claims to be anti-imperialist and a leftist to condemn war, and yet here we are sitting. I spent some time doom scrolling Twitter today and just seeing how pervasive the calls for further escalation, further involvement are. So
I think actually I've always seen a value in people who are heterodox. Like, I would say somebody like Glenn Greenwald is heterodox.
Definitely.
And I think he's proudly heterodox. Like, he wears that on his sleeve, and he's frequently championing people who are. He uses that word a lot. And I don't always agree with Glenn Greenwald. I don't know if actually there's anybody in the world who could say that they do always agree with him. But
is there any person you agree with always on every topic?
No, there isn't. There isn't. No, exactly. Now, I would not call myself heterodox, because I would say that, I think I think that there are times when my viewpoint does align with maybe a generally accepted view, or a more mainstream view. So I wouldn't I wouldn't not hold that view as a matter of principle, just in order to remain sort of, skeptical or contrary of those
Exactly.
views.
That's the danger, right?
Yes, yes. And so, my concern, and this may sound a bit trite, but my main concern is just sort of what to me anyways is right and what's wrong, what's true and what's not. And people who are in the status quo, in the mainstream, they can hold views that happen to be what I think happen to be correct. I think oftentimes they're not, but I think that they certainly can. That being said, I do think a person like a Glenn Greenwald is extraordinarily important, because I still think that even though maybe some of the sacred cows are sacred for a reason, that you always should have somebody who's at least forcing you to question those sacred cows and to come to your own conclusions about whether they should remain sacred or whether they shouldn't. So I see a really valuable place for heterodoxy. I personally could not commit myself to that position.
Yeah. The other question I guess I would raise is like the side is that I guess some people would call it a sort of logical fallacy, I think sometimes, but it's one that is very tempting for me at times. I know people like, I don't know if you know Freddie de Boer, right? So like he often says it's like, I am an old school Marxist, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, I haven't changed. Everyone else changed. And, and maybe it's worth even delving into a little bit about the way that our personal political biographies play into our willingness to embrace particular positions, right? Like, I mean, Freddie is, as far as I know, was raised in a like Marxist household. His dad was a professor. So that milieu, he really knows that. He isn't someone who just came to it online, right? It wasn't. Likewise for me, just very briefly, without getting into too much detail, I mean, like I was raised in I guess I would say small c conservative home. And, at the time of the first Iraq War, I wasn't particularly politically aware, even though I was, in first and second year university. And it was, but that moment of the Iraq War was very important for me in turning me to the left in anti-war protest, or at least coming around to the position of seeing the Iraq War as being, deeply immoral, and learning about American empire, learning about these things. So I've gone through various sort of a progression to come to the left, and I see the dangers of people who've never had to question the things that they believe.
Right.
And so unlike many people, I have changed my mind on things in my lifetime.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's worth being willing to do when we're talking about nuance is, and it's something we saw, I think, last week when Russia invaded, is, are you willing to say I was wrong? Are you willing to say I didn't call it right?
Right.
Because I don't see a lot of that out there. I see people doubling down. I see people holding to their positions because they are afraid of being seen as weak or wrong or right. And for me, there's a deep sense of, the danger of pride, but because of my history, I have challenged and changed my opinions on things over time. I hope not casually but through thought and through consideration of things.
Yeah, and I would say that I've had a similar trajectory, although I wouldn't necessarily say I grew up in a conservative home, but I certainly would say that I have had that sort of trajectory. In fact, in some ways, I think when I was really quite young, just as a way of being a bit of a young contrarian, I maybe held more conservative views than let's say my father did, just as a way of, that was my small form of rebellion. And it's been an ongoing trajectory since then. Maybe one might say it's just an entirely leftward drift since that time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that your moment sort of was with Iraq, and you're 2 years younger than I am, and my moment was with 9/11, I would say, and which really was, I mean, 2 years before the Iraq invasion. So you know, I definitely see what you're saying, and on top of that, another thing too, when you talk about pride, you know, it is. I think it's also the case that, you know, it's now almost a stigma to acknowledge that you've changed your view on something.
Mhm.
And so, you know, again, to borrow Greenwald's phrasing, he talks a lot about people who became, you know, socialists 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Really, I think what he means is people who had a sort of leftward drift in 2016, 2015,
Yeah.
during the Sanders heyday, basically. Um, but act as if they never really were anything other than that.
Yeah. I think what he's identifying there and something also is that when what I was gesturing toward earlier, this idea that we are entering a kind of a new stage of history, that for much of the 90s at least, and or up until I'd say the first term of Obama's presidency, that it was very easy to just pretend that politics didn't really matter too much.
Right.
That right, that you could hold just conventional liberal thought, right? But as the liberal order breaks down, that becomes increasingly untenable for some people, and
Right.
they're reaching out and latching onto different things. Some people have drifted into extremism. A lot of people came to leftism through the Bernie Sanders. Or, you know, I was reflecting earlier today that, and maybe this was something we get into, you know, earlier, like even the nuance within like Bernie Sanders. Like I'm a great admirer of Bernie in a lot of things.
Yeah.
One of the things I never held up much hope for was that if Bernie was ever elected, that it would mean a major change in U.S. foreign policy. Not because he wasn't, you know, he took a stand at least against the invasion of Iraq. If not, I believe he did vote for the invasion of Afghanistan, if I recall correctly. But um, in the United States, things were very focused on domestic politics.
Yes.
And so for me, probably of all the leftist leaders we've had in the last decade or so, I probably am more attracted to someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who has a
Right.
strong international view, you know, who's been an anti-nuclear weapon, you know, advocate, anti-apartheid, Palestinian liberation, these sort of freedom and movements and anti-imperial movements for a long, long time. And so, you know, just recognizing even within those figures who often get lumped together that there
Yes.
is distinctions, and some, but those things are often historical, and they're often contextual to where you live in
Yeah.
the country that you are part of. And so for many of us, I think a lot of us like to think that we come to all of our political opinions through careful thought and logic, but the reality is we inherit the great deal of a lot of our opinions. And when one inherits something, that can be useful, because we can't just think, we don't have the brain, you know, I hate to use computer metaphors, but bandwidth to try to think about every single thing. You know, there are times when it makes sense to go with the flow, but at the same time, there come moments when one is forced to consider why one believes what one believes, and make choices in that way. And I think, you know, we're in a time where people feel they've latched onto particular things, and now they're holding on to those things as the status quo. Right.
Yeah, because do you think that there's an overwhelming resistance for people to ask themselves that question of why I believe what I believe?
I think that, and maybe I'll reveal myself as somewhat of a my sort of maybe almost an Althusserian Marxist view, but it's like we're interpolated as subjects within a society to some degree,
Okay.
and we, you know, take the subject positions that you know, make sense to us in that way.
Yeah.
So I guess that returns me to that question of humility as well, about my own position and my own thoughts about things. So, you know, you joked about us being canceled, but I'd like to say that, like, it's like, I'd like to hope that I hold, you know, every position at least gently enough that if I was to be shown that I'm wrong, that I could, like, admit it and move and change.
Yeah. I feel the same way. I feel the same way.
It's a long preamble.
No, well, that's good. I think that's important, and I think we'll probably keep coming back to some of these points as we go through. But if we want to look at something that is specifically concrete, let's begin. I wanted to at least address this, the Emergency Act thing, and I definitely feel like I'm late to this, but I did want to maybe just sort of talk about it a little bit. That and I'm not sure in terms of your point of view on the protest, but as I say, like I did find myself, it struck me, and there's a good, for me at least, there was a good Henri Giraud article about the protest, which kind of goes into sort of some of the central organizers of the protests, how they have a very much a sort of anti-labor background, sort of harassing people on the picket lines and things like that. And it did sort of strike me that, as somebody who, I would ideally like to see a kind of, mass protest that's very, very much labor oriented, and very much class oriented, that those were not the things that were being foregrounded here. That it was to sort of go back to a point that I raised in the earlier video. It was a lot of people with genuine grievances at the establishment, and the kind of neoliberal order, kind of maybe being hijacked by this particular movement. But so that's my point of view. And
I think my position is some on the protest itself.
Mm-hmm.
You can do a whole other thing about maybe the fact that the protests exist in part because we've made dissent on some of their topics, including things like vaccine mandates. Like, I have people that I know who are close to me on all sides of these debates.
Yeah.
And so, and I'll be honest, I was one of those people when the pandemic began. I was very much on board with all of it. But, when I have a memory and I can remember, it is maybe a bit of an unfair thing to say it was 2 weeks to stop the spread, and now it's 2 years, right? And no end in sight on some things. Although I think obviously things have changed in the last few months, but for how long, who knows? If another wave comes through and things like that, so I found myself in the odd position of reading a lot from both sides of these debates.
Yeah.
So I would argue very nuanced views on the issue of, vaccine, the vaccines themselves, but vaccine mandates, particularly on the way that public health is used in societies, probably influenced by some of my more Foucauldian questions around biopower and things like that. But ultimately, I do think you can somewhat set that aside and ask the questions like, is there a space for legitimate debate on these things? Right. Do we just simply defer to, quote, experts?
Right.
On what, grounds?
Right.
In a democracy, right? And that the protest, I think I agree with your analysis that there were legitimate grievances mixed up with some leaders who had other ideas that I did, and particularly some of the ideas of the leaders, which I wasn't a big fan of. But the question of what constitutes a legitimate protest is an important one for me, precisely because of the way that state power has been leveraged against, political actors on the broad left, from land defenders, Wet'suwet'en, etc.
Yeah.
Fairy Creek. And I think the thing that to me that was the most dispiriting is that people on both sides of these political things could not see that I guess I didn't see a lot of these truckers standing up to defend the right of, land defenders when they disrupted train traffic in the West.
Right.
Right. The very same. And on the same time, so I guess I have that wacky old idea that our principles should actually be equally applied to all people.
Yeah,
right?
I agree with that.
I also think then that, I guess when it came to the protest, I do think that there should have been a legitimate space for protest, but should that hijack an entire downtown of our capital? That's a different question. Were there issues with policing? Should it have been, handled earlier? Should they have been moved to spaces that were less disruptive? Should there have been, all these kinds of questions? And I'm not sure either side in these really wanted to have those questions because they're so, the underlying concepts are so emotionally polarizing. I don't know if you saw on Saturday Night Live did a skit on COVID dinner party discussion. No. It is actually quite shocking because it shows the way that America is like quickly pivoting away from some of these things.
Right.
But someone brings up like a question about mask mandates, right? For instance, at the dinner party. And they're like all like, do we want to deal with this? And then Kenan Thompson had a very good line where he's like, all right, let's do this. Let's talk about this extremely emotional and complicated question. We're going to do it. You kind of steel yourself for this. And, that's kind of how everyone treads on this. It's like, we all want, because we're reasonable, liberal people, we don't want to be seen as those people who are illiberal and fascist. And what was the phrase that Trudeau, misogynist, racist, whatever, the litany of evils in our society. But I thought that was like, it captured that tone and nobody really wants to touch that. So instead we are debating tactics. We're debating, is honking terrorism, is shouting slurs at people, real violence, these kind of questions. Right.
Yeah.
And that's all before you even get to the leveraging of the Emergencies Act, which is unprecedented.
Yes.
Right. Really, literally, because as far as I understand it, and I'm not a constitutional or legal scholar, I am a communications and media scholar.
Yeah.
But this was brought in to replace the War Measures Act because it was seen that was too much of a blunt force instrument to deal with things after it was invoked by Trudeau's father in the October crisis in the 70s. The fact that this is the first time it's ever been used for this event, like whatever one thinks of this, you can think that they were horrible protesters, that what they were doing was, awful. And the question is, I'm like, is that really the most violent thing you've ever seen in your life? I mean, I'm not even denying that there were people who were harmed or harassed or spat on or whatever. Like, I'm just saying, like, you're calling down the maximum legal ability of the state to punish people over this.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's where I feel uncomfortable because, will this be used the next time? Something that, I'm also passionate about, like, Indigenous land rights or something.
Yes.
Used.
Well, it was in here. I'm actually just looking right now at an article by Nora Loretto, who has said, I think, a lot of good things about this topic, where she said...
It's interesting because I read Nora's piece, and Nora was very strongly pro-vax mandate, all these things, and yet I agree. I think go ahead, read from the...
Well, just the opening paragraph where she said, it didn't take tens of thousands of deaths to do it. It didn't take an uneven federal pandemic response. It didn't even take the most depraved conditions of human suffering within institutions in multiple provinces. It didn't take floods in Quebec, Alberta, or British Columbia, a heat wave in BC, or the melting Arctic either. No, it took a few hundred occupiers in 2 locations to push Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to invoke the Emergencies Act, marking it the first time that it's ever been used. And I think that really is a key point. And I'm not even sure if she's necessarily saying it should have been evoked in those earlier cases, but if it's going to be evoked in this particular case, why wouldn't it have been evoked in those cases, which strike her, and it strikes me, and it seems to strike you, as being much more extreme cases.
Yeah. And the thing is, I've had these conversations with people very close to me who were very much against this protest, who insisted, well, no, it was he had to, because the province wouldn't cooperate, because Ford was on their side, because there are a number of reasons why people have justified this, and frankly, they just don't ring true for me. I mean, like, I feel like we have a criminal code for a reason,
right?
that you can just charge people under violations of the criminal code, right?
Yes, yeah, you can do that, and I do think, yes, certainly there were things that they could have done in terms of using force that was not using this extreme force, which, by the way, if you're going to try to quell a belief that the government is tyrannical, the best way to go about doing it might not be to evoke the Emergencies Act. But
exactly.
Also just general, and I don't think this is actually unique to our time. I think that this has always been the case, that there's just always there's always been this kind of lack of democratic spirit in people.
Yes.
But that has been something that's been cultivated by the world in which we live, as you've been describing, where we're kind of taught to believe that it's somebody more important, more powerful, more intelligent than us who are going to be the ones to carry out, to take care of things for us. That we're not smart enough, strong enough, good enough to be able to do those things. I was about to slip into an Al Franken routine there for a second. But so, there were counter protests that were going on in Ottawa. And from what I understand, they were very much frowned upon by the Ottawa mayor, by the police. But I think that had they really been organized, had they been mobilized, had they grown, and had they chosen good tactics, that could have been an effective way to challenge these protests that were going on. But again, I think that that's so beyond what people generally think of how our lives are supposed to look, where we don't really become politically engaged more than just putting an X in a circle every couple of years.
Yeah, that's something I saw teaching undergrads, and I teach a lot of first year students. And when I speak about politics and political things, I'm very often I try to emphasize that I don't mean electoralism. I don't mean party politics. The question of the political is the question of how we govern society and how we make distinctions between different possible courses of action that collectively impact us, right?
Yeah.
So, this is why, I found some of the language of insurrection and stuff being used in this protest. I am aware that some of the leaders issued a memorandum of understanding calling for Trudeau to resign and for their, some of these people don't really understand how the Constitution works, etc. But but the point being, calling for the dissolution of Parliament is not in Canada a call for insurrection. It's a call for a new election, right?
Yeah.
The question is if you can marshal enough people, if the vote on the Emergency Act had become a vote of confidence, which it did, ultimately that falls or passes based on the coalitions that you can build in Canada.
Yeah.
That's how democracy works here. You don't, to say, one side or the other has a legitimate, you get back to a little bit to the phrase that has been used by many liberal politicians, that we are the natural ruling party of Canada. That just rubs me the wrong way, whatever.
Right. Yeah. And also if, now, here's why I like to at least be honest that I was opposed to the protest on ideological grounds. And again, I just want to make it clear when I say opposed to the protest, I'm not saying that I think that it should have been stopped. I just think that I disagreed with what seemed to be the central message of the protest. And
I would go so far as to say that I'm not really. I don't know if the protest is. I'm not really sure what their actual demands were.
I think I think that's fair, and I don't think there were any demands to be perfectly honest, any serious demands. I think that there were. I suppose what I mean then is to say that I'm ideologically opposed to the organizers of the event as far as I understood them. But suppose right now there was and here's why, again, I like to frame it in terms of ideology. Suppose that there was a disruptive protest going on at the Kremlin in Russia that was calling for, the dissolution of the Putin government. Would not that be something we should be supporting and saying is a good thing to do? I think most people would probably say that. Now, I think what they would say is, well, it's different because of the ideology involved, and I think, okay, well, that's fine, but let's make that the case on that grounds. But if you acknowledge that it's an ideological difference, then that's where we have to meet this. Like, we have to approach these people in terms of ideology and make our case against them. And they can make their case against us, and we'll see where it goes. But I think all of the kind of arguments about, is this a legitimate protest? Is it not a legitimate protest? And I agree with you. I think that there was a lot of ridiculous things going on in this protest. But I think all of those things are almost are not necessarily the most meaningful avenues to pursue.
And I guess this is where I kind of got the impression from a lot of people that while the debate circled around these issues, I think what you're getting at is that it ultimately came down to, do you broadly agree with what they're saying, or do you broadly disagree? And if you agree, you think that they're being treated unfairly and this is tyranny. And if you disagree with them, you're like, no, it's totally legitimate. It should be shut down.
Right.
And I don't, as you said, just be honest about that.
Yeah.
That's your position. Because
and here's where the nuance comes in, where I do disagree with them, but I don't think that they should have been shut down, at least not in the way that they were. As I say, I think a counter protest, which could have effectively shut them down, I think is certainly fair. Just as I would think it was fair if I was carrying out a protest for my lefty cause, if a counter protest group also tried to find a way to shut me down. I think that that's fair. And actually, I think that could be productive, because I think that those kinds of conversations could be productive, so long as they're happening in a way that's in the ways that are productive, nonviolent, ways.
I do want to get back to something you said about a sort of a authoritarian personality type that seems to exist along the whole spectrum of our political parties these days, or not parties, beliefs these days.
Yeah.
Right. But I do want to also pause on the ideological framing of opposing, say, let's pick something like a vaccine mandate. The blurring. Here's an example of a particularly difficult, nuanced case to make, which is that, I hate even having to do this because it feels like I'm trying to like legitimize my point of view. But like, okay, I'm triple vaccinated. It seems to me, from what I can tell, and again, I'm not a doctor or an epidemiologist, but the vaccines broadly work to prevent serious infection, right? It's also very clear to me that they did not significantly stop the spread during Omicron. So to me, that opens the door for the possibility that one could be pro-vax, whatever that even means. Like, I've always gotten vaccinated and trusted medical advice in most of my life, while holding a broadly anti-capitalist, anti-big pharma position. But on could one be pro-vax but anti-mandates? Under that's a very difficult position to have, because any kind of opposition to things has been lumped under anti-vax. I've seen it in CBC articles and other things that nuanced positions, and people would say, well, you're muttering the water. These are things that are too important that we have to have clarity along the whole spectrum. You cannot introduce nuance into this particular topic because people's lives are at stake.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the one thing I will say on that, just to sort of another possible very nuanced take on this. That then opens up the possibility that I could disagree with many the leaders of the protest, disagree with I agree with you that it's not an authentic labor movement, that it is mostly, owner operators and upper, middle class disgruntled people running it. And yet believe that maybe some of these things should be more open to debate in our society. In part because I actually don't see them as being inherently left or right. They've, over the last 2 years, in part because of the fact that Donald Trump was the president when the pandemic began, these things took on a particular framing and flavor that I don't think is inherent to the issues. Right? I don't know. Am I wrong? I don't know. Could one imagine an alternative world? I mean, counterfactuals are always a dangerous game to play, but where opposition to a vaccine mandate became coded as left wing.
Well, I don't know about left wing. Maybe so.
Or liberal. I don't know.
Liberal, I think, is an easier one to answer because I think we have an actual case of it where, what was it? Kamala Harris, when she was asked about, would she take the vaccine, and she said, "No, I wouldn't take the Trump vaccine."
Oh, you mean the one that we have?
Yeah, which was the vaccine. Yeah. So in that moment, she was a
but I actually think that many people in our society hold her view. That it's right. and it's so the nuance for me is that many views, including particularly some of the right-wing views, are incoherent.
Right.
That there isn't actually a thinking about these things in a broader issue. And for me, then I'll return to 9/11. That's my big issue around the security apparatus, biosecurity apparatus, and even the use of the Emergency Measures Act is that, I'm old enough to remember that, just because some guy tried to get a shoe bomb on, now whenever you fly to the States, you still have to take your shoes off. The TSA is still, Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11 as a new, security branch of the government. It still exists.
Yeah.
Despite there being very, very few terror attacks on U.S. soil in the intervening 20 years. So I guess that you hope you could forgive me. Yes. So I hope that a person could forgive me for being skeptical that people will give up their power when the threat subsides.
Well, and I think that the issue that you're raising here might even go beyond the issue of nuance, which is just the fact that politics for so many has become more like a sport than anything else. But again, I would say that that's just a consequence of the fact that people generally are not encouraged political in the sense that you have mentioned it, like the conversations that you have in class, that their conception of politics does not go beyond social media politics. And social media just encourages that kind of tribalism and point scoring. So when you've got tribes and you've got point scoring, you're automatically going to be treating politics like it's a sport, and you have no other conception of what politics is supposed to be. And so when that is going on, then inevitably, you're going to have people holding the views they hold, not because they believe that they're right, not because they really understand them, but really because the people on their team are saying that, and they want to be on that team.
Exactly. I 100% agree with that. Earlier this week in my communication theory class, Com 101 class, we were talking about social judgment theory and how we come to make judgments in a particular field. And we talked about the Overton window and how that gets shifted. We read a little bit of Noam Chomsky on manufacturing consent and things, but we also talked about how when we judge messages, we can easily fall into contrast and assimilation errors. And I think that when we have teams, broad camps, it's very easy to say exactly what you said, that when a belief falls within that same team, it falls within our, what's called in the theory latitude of acceptance. And so we have a tendency to be take it on simply because of where our anchor points are in relation to other people, and we reject some things which we due to a contrast error, just simply because it's part of that other camp, and this leads to this polarization of ideas that aren't even necessarily inherently aligned in any particular way. And this made a lot of sense actually I think to the students. They seem to find that, and they found it helpful to trying to understand why people took on beliefs that they did. I used the example in class of the during the marches and protests after George Floyd's murder, the calls to abolish or at least defund the police, and even right there, that choice of abolish or defund is already a nuance that's introduced. Do you want to abolish the police? Do you want to simply defund the police?
Yeah.
Do you simply believe that there are serious issues of racial injustice within policing? Is it rotten to the core? Doesn't or not? And I saw a lot of people take on positions that I don't think that they seem to be committed to holding to right now. Right. And there's, I didn't really mean, when I said abolish the police, I really meant that no, we need to fire the bad cops. There used to be more DEI training. We need to take away some of their money and move it into social services. I'm like, that all seems very reasonable.
Yeah.
But that's also a little bit of that Mott and Bailey fallacy that people throw around, that idea that you propose a very, very broad or radical position, but then when you're pushed on it, you only are defending this really core idea that's much more easy to defend in some ways, right? So you retreat inward. And I don't think everyone does that. I think for most people, it's not actually a Mott and Bailey fallacy. I think it's more simply an assimilation error, a desire not to be seen as on that other side. So I cannot say, are you sure you want to abolish all policing? Because if I say that, even right now, somebody watching this might be, he's a right winger. He's not on our side. He must be a racist or something. It's like, well, no, I 100% agree with the fact that there are serious problems with policing, not only in the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. But I just reject that framing that one has to sign on to any and all radical positions within, or even reasonable centrist positions if they tend to fall within that latitude of broadly liberal or left categories. I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. What the thing that you're raising, though, that kind of irks me as a in terms of my political thinking, not that you irked me, but just
I can irk you, please.
No, but you didn't in this case. But again, and that was a particular. I mean, I hold all sorts of views that I think are, I will acknowledge are extreme. I believe, I think that an ideal world would be a stateless society. My ideal world is kind of articulated in Imagine. But look, I'm not going to go around making videos about it, and I'm not going to go around saying
let John Lennon do that.
Yeah, John Lennon can do it. I mean, that is the kind of thing that can be done in poetry or in art.
Imaginative capacity is different from politics, though.
Different from politics. Abolish the state. Sure. Yeah, sure. But I don't see what use that has. I don't see what political use that there is in articulating that point of view right now, because the public is nowhere near that issue, just absolutely nowhere near it. And so there's no value in talking to me in saying those things. I can talk about it sometimes.
There is a value, though.
Okay.
Well, not a value that I support, but the value is in showing yourself to be more pure and better or more extreme than someone else.
Yes.
It's a kind of gainsaying over other people.
Yeah, and also it allow me to fit in with a group of people who would also say abolish the state or something.
And that feels good to have a small tight group of people who believe the same things you do, even though they seem to be way out on the fringe. I guess we've seen that in other groups. That can be a dangerous thing, right? Like,
yes, yeah, absolutely.
And so the same thing about a lot of these anti-vax groups.
So I would be the person in the group of abolish the state people saying, I don't think we should hold up these signs saying abolish the state. I don't think that. And again, if things are tribal and it's all about point scoring, that group would say, no, that's a terrible point of view to have. You have to hold up these positions, even if we know inherently that it's not going to. Not only will it not achieve that end, it might even stall that end, because you make yourself look ridiculous.
So what you're actually gesturing toward here, Jesse, is the is-ought distinction in politics and strategic versus moral considerations.
Yes.
Right.
I think if you're not strategically, you're not being political. Sorry. Go ahead.
Exactly, because I think that ultimately one's moral positions are not purely political. Your politics is informed by your values and ethics, but it is not identical. Because we live in a pluralistic society where you have to deal with people who do not share your moral framework.
Yeah.
And so there's absolutely, strategic considerations. I'm not saying that you lie to the populace in order to try to bring them into your camp, but there's also something, exactly what you said, that there are certain messages that you have to admit to yourself are unpopular. And maybe you should start with things that are popular.
Exactly. It's like, to go back to somebody like Bernie Sanders. Sanders was, I had heard interviews where Sanders was talking about the value of co-ops, a cooperative business, meaning, as far as I understand them, a kind of democratically self-run business, worker-run business, which I'm in favor of.
Yeah.
But how many times did you hear him really talk about that when he was on the political stage? He barely ever talked about that. He talked about primarily healthcare for all, and that because that has always
very popular,
a very popular position. And that's he knew what he was doing, and if you're going, and he was very successful doing that, and that's what being politically strategic is about.
Absolutely.
Not about showing how morally pure you are, how what is the most extreme position you can have. It's about understanding what the limits of the society are that you live in, and try and push up against that as much as you can. Try and budget.
Now, this might actually be a perfect issue or concept in which to pivot to discussing the war in Ukraine.
Yeah,
because many of the same people who, would probably agree, on quote strategic choices, who I believe that was their argument for why, for instance, vote for Joe Biden, right? Even if he's not your favorite candidate, you vote for him because he can beat Trump. I disagree with that logic. That's a whole other thing. But they were making a strategic, generally, rather than a moral case that he was by far the best or most progressive candidate. Right. Even some of them, the people who voted for him, probably might have preferred, I don't know, Kamala or Pete Buttigieg or something, right? Like, I don't know. But if you were to bring up the issue of war, they suddenly become moralists.
Right.
And now that may seem strange because to many people, war is an extremely moral thing, right? Like, people are dying. It's life and death. And that, for me, though, is why strategy is of the utmost importance when we're talking about war, is because your actions have consequences whether you're right or not.
Yeah.
So and now I'll put my cards on the table with the war in Ukraine. I'm with you. I condemn whatever. Who cares? I didn't feel the need to put out a press release because I think I've been pretty consistent in tweeting about it. When I tweet about politics online, it's generally on my Twitter account. It's generally anti-war. I try to every year. I try to post something on the anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan and things like that. So anti-nuclear stuff is I take it pretty seriously. Maybe as a childhood fascination and fear of this thing. Mm-hmm. And And I do think many people are being very unserious. Like, once you have a potential for a war between nuclear armed states, I don't care if you're right.
Mm-hmm.
You need to move carefully, because even if you're saying, oh, it's, I saw someone, it's a very small chance. Yeah, I agree, it probably is. But it's such, the consequences are so grave that it, outweighs. This is the very same argument that these very same people would have made about COVID. They would have said, I would have said to them, yeah, you have a 99.99% chance of surviving COVID, especially if you've got a vaccine. Like, why are you worrying about this at all? But that tiny little chance is life or death. And I can understand the emotion around that. So I don't understand what I would say there's a greater than, this may sound insane, but I'd say there's a greater than 0.001% chance that if the United States and Russia got into a shooting war, that a nuke would go flying.
Yeah. If that happened, certainly. Actually,
that wouldn't just be the individual's death of a viral disease, which viruses have hurt human beings for many years. And thankfully, we do have modern medicine. That would potentially entail the extinction of all humans, or at best, a nuclear winter that plunges majority of the population into suffering and death. Right.
I want to, if you could oblige me just maybe about 4 or 5 minutes, because I think I've told you about this before, and actually I have a few videos lined up, but I want to show this one because it really does speak to, it has nothing to do, well, it's maybe tangentially it does actually, but it doesn't have anything directly to do with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but it is a video of Noam Chomsky in about 92, 93 being interviewed by Phil Donahue and this other guy, Posner. And he's being asked about Bosnia. And it's before, this would be roughly 5 years before the conflict really intensifies. But I think that I think Chomsky's response here is instructive, and it speaks to what you have just said. So I want to actually, hold on a second. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Let me see here. Okay. I'm going to show this. So hold on a second. Is it coming up at all?
Something's come up here, so I think you're on the right track.
Okay, hold on.
I can see your cursor. So there you go.
Former Yugoslavia. What might Professor Chomsky want to share with us about this agony today and the United States' responsibility about it?
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think that's been primarily U.S. responsibility. It's been tragic the way it's been handled. The situation has reached a point where it's not easy to think of a constructive solution anymore. A few years ago, there were options. At this point, I think
Sorry, was it playing any sound there?
Yeah, I could hear.
Oh, it was. Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm going to keep playing it. Sorry.
So the way in which the Yugoslavian breakup was handled was almost guaranteed to lead to extreme conflict. I think that's primarily a European responsibility in this case. Germany insisted on a very rapid breakup without any preparation. In fact, insisted that they were going to go through it alone, which means Europe has to go along. If Europe didn't agree and the rest of the world didn't agree.
By recognizing the independence of the different...
Yeah, I mean, Slovenia was pretty straightforward. I mean, that just pulled out, became independent, no great strife. The insistence on Croatian independence, however, was done without recognition of the fact that there's a substantial Serbian minority, and that was a guarantee of war. And in fact, then there was a bitter war. Bosnia was recognized without any preparation. Again, big Serbian minority and Croatian minority, and the spillover from the Serbian-Croatian war, immediately brought them into it, and it was just done in such a fashion as to maximize everything going wrong, and it did go wrong. Now, at this point, when you ask for constructive proposals at this point, it's pretty hard to suggest them. There are things one I think there probably are palliatives, and one can imagine improvements, but a substantial to deal with the problem in a really constructive fashion is not easy. I've yet to hear a serious proposal.
Would you agree with the view that that seems to be pretty much predominant in world media today, that it's really the Serbs who are the killers, the rapists, the murderers, and so on?
Well, in these conflicts, the ones who commit most of the atrocities are the ones who have most of the guns. And in fact, they have most of the guns, yes, so they're committing most of the atrocities. I mean, it's not that they have different genes or anything like that.
No.
I am struck by your humble confession here, or statement of helplessness. It comes from one of the most millions feel courageous social critics of our time. You almost went to jail in your protests of the Vietnam War. You have been thunderous in your denunciation of United States foreign policy in Central America and elsewhere. You are the person who has reminded us most often of the probability of power and violence expressed by just about all governments. And here you are saying, boy, I don't know what to do in Bosnia.
As I say, there were things that could have been done.
Right.
But they weren't done.
But what does your
now, what do we do
tell you
now?
We have babies being slaughtered.
Well, I think there are, as I say, there are probably palliatives. For example, I think the embargo on Bosnia, arms embargo, should have been lifted a long time ago. It's based, in effect, a unilateral embargo.
In other words, let them feed the children. Is that your point?
No,
let them have arms.
Let the Muslim community have arms.
There's an arms embargo, which in effect is unilaterally on Bosnia, because that's the only, no one else is paying any attention.
So just hand out the guns and let them shoot each other.
No, I think there's more than that. I mean, I think it should be possible. I mean, there are technical problems that one shouldn't underestimate. Yeah. And you have to know the topography, and you have to know where who's going to shoot from which direction and so on. But it's hard to imagine that there isn't a way to, with a show of force and maybe even a threat of possibly even use of force, to at least improve delivery of humanitarian aid and to silence the guns shelling Sarajevo. Now, we shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of that. That's a technical problem. You have to know how to do that, You can't just say, well, let's send out the planes and do it. But I imagine that would be possible. On the other hand, if you talk about serious intervention, chances are it would cause a lot more problems than it would. It could have quite unpredictable consequences. So, say, take the possible reaction inside Russia. I mean, it's no big secret that there's an old tradition. You can read in Tolstoy's novels, about we got to save the Serbs, to save the Serbs from the Turks or whatever.
Turks, right.
That's an old tradition in Russia. There's a lot of concern in especially nationalist circles and military circles in Russia about the breakup of the system, the humiliation, and so on. It's entirely possible that, in fact, there already are Russian so-called volunteers fighting with the Serbs.
You say so-called, you don't think they're really volunteers? I think they are.
Maybe they are. Yeah.
I think there are. Not a few Russians who are happy to fight on the Serb side.
Suppose that the segments of the military really become involved. Suppose they go down there with, tactical nuclear weapons on their backs, which you can think of a lot of ugly possibilities. And those, or suppose that some sort of international intervention would stimulate the Serbs to carry out the kind of desperate and violent acts that are not uncommon in small states or communities that feel themselves embattled. For example, they might decide to move on Kosovo, bringing in the Turks, in fact, which is not impossible. You could have a Balkan War. Now, all of these are possible consequences of direct intervention, and not to be treated lightly.
So the reason why I wanted to show that was not to draw to find a point between these two incidents, but rather to say that here was a moment where Donahue was really shocked that he's got this what he calls a kind of leading intellectual figure, and this leading intellectual figure's answer to the question of what should we do is kind of like, I don't know if there's an effective solution to this problem right now. There were effective solutions, they weren't taken, and now we're in it. And so and I think that partly I am reminded a little bit of, what happened after 9/11, because I remember that I was against the invasion of Afghanistan. And when you were against the invasion of Afghanistan, that was a hard position to take. I mean, when you're 21 years old, you can pretty much say anything. And
like I personally was more of the like Obama style, like had no question that, you go in to get bin Laden in Afghanistan, obviously disastrous 21 years later. And Iraq, once, the lie of WMDs became clear, then it was, much easier to oppose that.
Yeah.
But I think you took that a much harder stance, which is to say, one tiny little thing about the video is funny.
Yeah.
I just know. So he talked about Russians fighting in, Bosnia and places like that.
Yeah.
And I do know there were Russians who went. I don't know if you know who Edward Limonov was.
No.
He's this really crazy guy. He was featured in the most recent Adam Curtis documentary. Can't get it in my head, but he went and he fought, and he fought with Milosevic on the Bosnian side. He was a Russian. He was a very transgressive sort of punk type figure who had lived in New York City in the 70s, leaving the Soviet Union, and then he ended up going back to Russia and starting the like National Bolshevik Party, the sort of Nazi Nazbol party kind of. Anyway, weird figure, but so there definitely were Russians fighting.
And what he talks about when he eventually gets into, when Chomsky talks about there could be this civil war that comes about, that's exactly what happened. I mean, exactly what he says comes to pass. And that is in some ways, if I'm going to be charitable with these people, it would be to say that they don't think about what the consequences are of any of their actions at any time. They just think about what feels right in the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And in terms of the Ukraine issue, that has been true every single step of the way, because we certainly have seen evidence, I think, compiled over the last week, that ever since the late 90s, when you started to see this NATO push expansion, there were plenty of experts saying this is only going to have negative consequences. Actually, just to give some examples, George Kennan says in 1998, this is the years here I think are important, because it's 98, 99 when we first see the big expansion. And
when Putin takes power in Russia too, after the puppet Yeltsin was, dies.
Yes, exactly. The Russian leader who the United States intellectuals take credit for basically putting into power. Kennan said in 98, I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. This is he talking about NATO's enlargement. I think it's a tragic mistake. Then in 2008, when you see the Bush administration making really their first overtures to Ukraine in terms of bringing them into NATO, the CIA director, Bill Burns, said Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for Russia, and I've yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. So, I mean, quite apart from the question of whether or not Ukraine should be in NATO, it was certainly understood by even conventional supporters of American empire that this action was going to be understood as a hostile act.
Right. The problem right now is you can't make that comment because people assume that you're justifying or defending Putin. It's like, no, like I can hold that what he did was wrong. That he should not invade Ukraine. He should not be shelling Kiev and Kharkiv.
That was the classic argument during 9/11, right?
Yeah.
Where if you said the United States has a history of meddling into the affairs and causing a tremendous amount of instability throughout the Middle East, the response was, well, then you're trying to justify what the terrorist did. It's like, no, what the terrorist did was awful. It was an atrocity. It was an act of terrorism. It should be quite rightly understood as an illegal act. It was terrible. But we have to also understand that there were steps that led to this moment.
Actions have consequences.
Actions have consequences.
Blowback is a real thing.
Yeah, and if you ignore those actions, you are paving the way to ensuring that they're gonna perpetuate.
The other thing I've seen thrown around is that to say that Ukraine should not join NATO is to deny the Ukrainians their free and autonomous choice as a country, right? And this fits very comfortably. Unfortunately, I see it fitting very comfortably into the sort of I don't know if you want to call it Samantha Power style expansion of liberal democracy, that's been used, that humanitarian and human rights and democracy used as a reason for intervention, a reason for expanding these things, never asking why it so conveniently favors, the interests of America. Now, the other thing is, though, I don't think you actually even need to go as far as NATO to ask these questions. I mean, like, people forget, in 2014 we had a coup after the Maidan protests, which overthrew Yanukovych, who was, not particularly popular and was a pro-Russian leader. But it is, that was fomented by likely American groups who aided some of the worst far right elements in Ukraine against this stuff. Again, not saying that this justifies anything that Putin did, but like, can you not see that your actions have consequences?
Yeah.
You install the Shah in Iran. Don't be shocked when the people revolt.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that if there is any way to resolving this issue now, if people are serious when they say that they care about what happens to the Ukrainian people, which I think we should be serious about those things, we need to understand that history, because at the end of the day, it's this. If there's going to be a solution to this that doesn't end in bloodshed, well, there's already been bloodshed, but if there's something
more
that
bloodshed,
it doesn't end in more bloodshed and extreme bloodshed that's global, then,
or even for Ukraine, I think we need to recognize at this moment. I mean, people may disagree with my statement on this, but it's undeniable. I don't think any of the numbers on casualties that we have right now are probably accurate. We're still in the midst of the fog of war, and in the Twitter social media age, we expect instant results, right? I mean, people forget that even the invasion of Iraq and the securing of Baghdad took 5 days. With a massively overpowered army against a much weaker force, right? And the Ukrainians forces have shown that they're not going to roll over, right? But like, we're not talking about indiscriminate mass murder at this point,
right?
And let's keep it that way.
Let's keep it that way. Exactly. And I think I think that from our perspective, and we can only control what we do, and as somebody who my country, our country is a signed member of NATO, so I feel like we that's where our responsibilities lie,
and we have a strong Ukrainian historical connection in Canada. Growing up in Western Canada, especially in Saskatchewan, Alberta, there are a lot of Ukrainian settlers, right? Many of whom were the anti-Russian, anti-Soviet ones who left.
Well, and
in World War II.
I do think I've been pleasantly surprised at how effective the Ukrainians have been at keeping Russians at bay to the extent that they have in this invasion. It would be great if again that sort of local collective action was was able to push them back and to prevent them from invading even more. And also how great it is to see sort of anti-Putin forces at work within Russia.
People protesting in Moscow, there are real consequences to that in a way that's
a dangerous choice
we don't face here.
No.
So when I see, I heard numbers of maybe 1,000 or even 1,500 people protesting, that takes real bravery.
Absolutely. So yeah, but I do think that, like, again, to go back to this idea of nuance, like, it's just not nuanced to say, I'm not sure any sort of direct concrete action right now is going to be the most effective solution.
I also think that you have to be very careful about, like, just, I do think it's irresponsible, if I can use that phrase, of people online or people in the West saying, dump weapons into Ukraine and arm the people. Like, on the one hand, they deserve the right to try to, hold their country. On the other hand, it's like, you don't really want to send untrained soldiers up against Russian forces. They're going to get slaughtered.
Yeah.
Then you're, like, this isn't, you want to have some sort of children's crusade type thing going. Where you're, in the name of your injustice, you end up getting a lot more innocent people killed who, at this point, probably would be better off either. It's not a great choice. Nobody wants to become a refugee. Nobody wants to be forced out of their homes and things like that. But, like, like, that whole idea that people are going to create Molotov cocktails and, like, fight back against tanks is not cool.
Yeah, and I think, again, like, and that's, beyond just the general sadness that comes with an invasion, the other thing that does make that does kind of make me a bit sad about this is that sort of that immediate post 9/11 mentality that I recall it very well, because, as I say, that is when I first really became kind of politically invested.
Mm-hmm.
That mentality still is still pretty much there, because when I said, I don't think even though obviously the terrorist attack was a terrible terrorist attack, I don't think the answer is to invade Afghanistan. The common response is, well, we have to do something. What should we do? And
here's something. You got to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Logic doesn't hold.
It doesn't hold. It doesn't hold at all. And at that time, I remember you couldn't say, well, I don't know what we should do, but I don't think it should be this. It was you had to have some kind of if it's not going to be invading Afghanistan, what is it going to be? You're going to have to give me something, or else this is what we're doing. Despite all the the credit people give themselves for how much more advanced we are than we were 20 years ago or whatever, it doesn't strike me that we are. I
think to go back even further, I think it's some of the same thing that we saw in COVID. It's like, yes, undoubtedly, this is a great tragedy. People died. The virus sucks that it exists. And we want someone to blame, and we want someone to do something about it.
Yeah.
But the imperative to do something comes with costs as well. And I think there were times when we embraced doing something without either thinking about the cost or the effectiveness of what we were choosing to do. Outside of very localized things, like, things have spillover effects, and in this case, we're seeing the same thing. But there's this sort of, like, prejudice for action, or, like, a default to acting, which is really, I think, deep seated in a lot of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us have that. I think we can acknowledge, like, you get antsy when you can't do something, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that it takes a lot of, I don't know if bravery is the right term, or strength of character to do it, like what Chomsky said, and say, sometimes I don't know what we can do.
Yeah.
Sometimes there may not be a good option.
Yeah.
And where was I going with this? That when it comes to war, though, like, I really like the amount of irresponsible takes that I've seen around Ukraine are just shocking. Like, and part of it is ignorance, though.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, like, when someone's calling for a no-fly zone, like a no-fly zone, Ukraine can't enforce it themselves. So now you're asking for NATO or EU to enforce a no-fly zone. I don't think people realize that it sounds like a nice term, right? It's just a no-fly zone. You just can't fly there. You know, it's like, no, you're asking for enemy forces to shoot on Russian planes. You're vastly increasing the possibility for a shooting war between great powers and escalation.
Yeah, people don't know what these terms mean, and you know, like I say, it is. I do think that it is kind of great that in the last 7 years there has been this rush towards people thinking more politically, but I feel like we all have to remember not only those of us who have maybe been politically inclined for a longer period of time, but also the people who just became political more recently. That, you know, there's still a lot of things that they have to kind of learn.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of things
humility.
to figure out.
We all need humility.
We all need humility.
Like, I had to swallow. Like, I really didn't think that Russia would invade. I'll be honest. I'll put my cards on the table, because I didn't see, like, the people who were telling me that it was inevitable were behaving in a way that didn't tell me that they were taking it seriously.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's quite possible that I was wrong, but that they were still spitballing and trying to throw things at the wall to see what. And it just happened that they were right that time.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
We could all have a little bit of humility there. The other thing about is to recognize the flip. This is the flip side of this, is that there's a really great. He's actually a very good writer. He's a philosopher, early modern philosopher. I don't know if you know Justin E.H. Smith. He has a Substack, and he's a professor in Paris. He's American.
Oh, I do know him. Yeah, you've only because you've sent me things.
Yeah, I think he's a very good writer and very thoughtful. He wrote a piece. The only thing he's written so far post Ukraine is that, but the cost of pacifism. And Justin has spent some time in Russia, and he speaks Russian, and especially in the far east, in among the Saka people in like Yakutsk, in that area. But he does some translation work there of their legends and things. And he spent some time in the early 90s in Moscow. But he brought up a really good point that a lot of us, though, the flip side is that a lot of us have this sort of cheap pacifism where we kind of just want to, like, you know, I'm vaguely against war, but, you know, but ultimately the cost is other people die. Right. And I don't have to fight.
Right.
Real pacifism has costs. And a lot of it takes real bravery to be really a pacifist, to do like a Gandhi thing where, like, we will win by you killing us to the point that you can't handle it anymore. And, you know, for someone like me who's informed deeply by like Christian tradition and stuff like that, I think that's the radical pacifism that most Christians don't want to admit is, you know, it's Ash Wednesday today, the beginning of Lent for Christians in the Western tradition. You know, it is literally not, you know, be a pacifist unless they're really bad, then you go to war. You know?
Yeah.
It's they will nail you to the cross and kill you.
Yeah.
And I understand if someone rejects that philosophy, and I understand, but that's what a deep commitment to pacifism ultimately entails. And I think it actually might be more difficult than fighting.
I think so. So a couple things there. I mean, for one, I wouldn't call myself a full-on pacifist. I would put myself in the camp that would say that there are probably times when you know, a show of force is.
I'm probably more a pragmatist as well.
Yeah. But I do think that But also at the same time, I think it's kind of necessary for people on the left to recognize that that's a legitimate position to hold, the total pacifist position. That's another thing that a lot of, and this I think was in Freddie DeBoer's article, maybe, or he may have touched on it, that a lot of the more recent political converts or left converts don't grasp is that the left has a history of debating tactics, that there are a variety of tactics that are in play, and we have to be open about that and go back and forth about that, and have those kind of discussions and have those kind of debates, that it's not just about there's one right tactic. If you don't agree with that tactic, then you're not a true leftist. That's not the left tradition. The left tradition has always been about a plurality of different ways to see things, and that tradition extends from people who are more pragmatic in terms of the idea of violence. And then there are people like Gandhi and A.J. Musty and all those people like that. I don't know if it's Musty or Must, M-U-S-T-E, who are just a total pacifists. The other thing is that, but along those lines, Norman Finkelstein raises this point where he says that quite unfortunately, that scenario where the pacifist is putting their life on the line and quite possibly losing their life in their cause is the thing that compels most people to action, that mobilizes action, which is unfortunate. And actually, I think that it's almost the job of the left to find out how you can mobilize that same sort of action without that kind of thing. But if you notice, just to go back to the Ottawa protest for a second, right now, the far right, or the whatever you want to call them, seem to be easily mobilized in a way that their anger can be the thing that like brings them into protest. Mm-hmm. Whereas the left seem to usually require something like the George Floyd murder, which obviously should have brought people out onto the street, but so should have all sorts of other things. Why aren't we mobilized by our anger about what the political establishment is doing?
That may be another discussion for another time about the state of the left, as many of the I don't even know many of the people on the left today are people like, I will say, like us, who are relatively comfortable.
Yeah.
And how do we bring in people who are actually have anger and suffering into our positions?
Which is hard. But I don't think it will happen by saying abolish the state.
Because a lot of people have an affection, rightly or wrongly, for their state.
That's right.
And we're seeing that right now when people say Ukraine has a right to exist as a country. People have a pride in being Ukrainian.
That's right.
Now, that's complicated. That can be true, as well as the statement that they have a long intertwined history with Russia.
Yes.
It is true. That goes back centuries.
Yes, it does.
It's complicated, and it's not. And Putin does not have the right to walk in and take their country.
Yeah.
At the same time, maybe there should have been some discussion about whether some of the predominantly Russian-speaking peoples in the Far East would like their independence,
Well, and I think that, again, when we talk about what steps could have been taken, in this particular case, there were the Minsk II accords, which was I think France, Germany, Ukraine, and Russia. I think those were the key players involved, which was probably the agreement that was maybe the best hope to have avoided something like this. And that was, what that called for largely is exactly what should have happened to Ukraine from the very beginning, which was just to make Ukraine a neutral country, a kind of Austrian style country like it was in the Cold War, or like Finland or something like that, a neutral country but also a federated country where like regions like the Donbass region would have their a certain degree of autonomy, and that was to me a strong diplomatic arrangement which no player involved were serious about actually committing to, and I think largely because of that we are at the stage that we are today.
Yeah. I would agree. The unfortunate thing is that Monday morning quarterbacking, as they say, is a lot more successful than playing the game. And now we have to play the cards as they're dealt.
That's right.
And it might be a very bad hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I can mix different game metaphors.
but I think that understanding that history, that agreement was there, that nobody involved was serious about committing to it, that in fact during the post-Minsk II agreement period, the United States and NATO were encouraging Ukraine to deal with their internal problems in a military fashion, which went against the spirit of the Minsk Accord. You had Zelensky coming into power, very popular on the grounds that he was going to bring peace to the region. Slowly, that starts to erode again and becomes more friendly with the NATO alliance. All of these things are playing a role, and I think that if the same people who would choose to ignore that history should not be the people who are settling the issue that's going on right now. And it is, you're absolutely right that that moment has passed, and now we have to kind of deal with what's going on now. But if it's the same mentality that was at work before that is trying to work out things now, I don't have particularly high hopes for what the solution is going to be.
But we have to be open to actually thinking about those things, thinking about history, thinking about nuance. If you go back to our very topic, like, these things are not simple. No.
So normally I'm the optimistic voice on this channel, but this one's got me.
Yeah, no, I definitely am feeling not good about things.
Yeah, I remember when just one more Chomsky reference. I remember when years ago I sent him this email because he said something in an interview about his life, and he said something like the most you can hope for is 120 years or something like that. And at the time he was like maybe 80 years old or something like that. So I sent him an email saying, I read that you said this. I said, if that's the case, I'm looking forward to 40 more years of your work. And he said, and so I can't remember when that was. That was probably 2004, 2005, around that time. So forgive me if I'm getting all my dates wrong in terms of how old he actually was. But he said that the 120 years was a Jewish expression. Good luck. We wish you good luck for 120 years, I think, or something like that. And he said, and then his final sentence was, quite honestly, I don't want to see the world what the world looks like at that point.
Yeah.
So, that's but I do still hold out hope that there's possibilities for things going well, and but I do think that it will have to come with an understanding of the things that led to this moment.
Yep, and understanding that people have to own the consequences of whatever their next actions are.
Yeah,
and make decisions in the full knowledge that there will be consequences, and that goes for whether it's Putin or NATO or whoever.
Yeah, and just to bring it back full circle to the topic, I think the only way that we can plausibly have these conversations where we try to resolve things based on acknowledging what happened previously is to be nuanced enough to understand that doing that does not mean that you are accepting the things like what Putin is doing, which
exactly,
of course we don't.
I hope that this is helpful for people like thinking through like that these issues that seem to have such clear cut, you know, distinctions can actually have you can actually hold nuanced positions coherently.
Yes, absolutely. I hope so too. I mean, we didn't even verge into, and I'll just say this, we won't go into it, but we didn't even verge into the territory of something like free speech, which is, I know, something that we have talked about before.
Absolutely.
Quite a bit, which strikes me as actually, as Freddie DeBoer would say, strikes me as an actually traditionally left-wing view.
It is.
But is now largely kind of assigned as being a right-wing view.
Which, again, it's just like frankly, with like the issue of like social control and authoritarian sort of control of a society is not traditionally a left wing.
No, no, exactly.
At least not, especially not in the Western tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
You know, and the person I've been thinking about the last is someone like Eugene Debs.
Mm.
Yeah, when he opposed World War One, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was not a popular thing that he was, accused of, just abandoning the European allies, abandoning Europe into a state of chaos, and literally served time in prison for it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, again, that takes bravery to do that. I hope it doesn't come to that if I, I'm not willing to sign up to fight in Ukraine, that they ship me off to prison. But
I think for now you're safe. But,
I think so.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example. I often think about how somebody like Howard Zinn would fare in today's climate, because Zinn Zinn was a pacifist.
Mm-hmm.
Zinn actually fought in World War II, but that's what made him a pacifist.
Yeah.
And
in the so-called just war.
That's right. And then largely went on to, there's a lecture that he gives that's somewhere on YouTube where he talks about how, the three wars, I think it's the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, and how they're often positioned as just inevitable wars. And that talk, he's interrogating that point of view. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with that, but I am suggesting that that's a legitimate.
It's also worth thinking about, and if you oppose it and don't agree with it, it's worth articulating why and not just taking it for granted.
Yeah, exactly. So
that's the thing. Someone could disagree with lots of the things I said here. Something kind of liberating, just saying what you actually think about some things too.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm open to hearing people's arguments. I just haven't heard very many good ones so far.
Yeah, I am as well. I absolutely, in case anybody's is watching this and thinking, well, he only has on people that agrees with what he's saying. I'm happy to have on a wide variety of views. So if anybody does disagree with the points that I'm raising, I'm happy to have you on and have those discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So, but and I mentioned this, I think, in the I'll wrap this up in just a minute, but mostly because my battery power is running out. But I mentioned this in the other video on the Ottawa protest, that my conception of democracy is kind of like 12 Angry Men. Which, have you seen that movie, 12 Angry Men?
Oh yeah, I've seen it several times. Yeah,
it's one of my favorite movies.
Henry Fonda. Yeah,
oh yeah, fantastic.
Although my favorite Fonda is Grapes of Wrath. But
yeah, well, Grapes of Wrath, phenomenal. But Henry Fonda, just as I watch more and more old movies, was definitely one of the great ones. But that's my conception. 12 Angry Men, I think, is one of the best articulations of democracy that there is, which is that you have a group of 12 people. It begins with 11 people believing one thing and one person believing the other, and they gave that one person an opportunity to counter what the 11 people said, and in the space of a few hours ends up switching the numbers around. And that's the potential that democracy has. And I think that's the kind of spirit that because some people today hold the spirit that, either if you are the 11, that, because there's 11 of you and one of the other, then that means that's what
you lost. Yeah.
Then yeah, exactly. Or there's the person who's the one who thinks that their idea is so right that they just automatically should have their right as a sort of de facto privilege of being the right one. Neither of those positions to me are particularly good ones to hold, and I don't think help us progress as a democratic society. So I'm always open for hearing what the other side of the argument is, just as I hope other people would be open to hearing mine too. So
thanks for, yeah. I actually not sure I totally agree with you on that.
Well, that's fine. That's good. Okay. Well, that's a discussion for another time. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely that's a thing that I don't even would never foresee happening in my lifetime, probably not even my child's
I mean, would I love some kind of Star Trek: The Next Generation style, post scarcity, United Earth type thing? Sure, that'd be great. In which we still can respect culture and that kind of thing. That'd be great.
Yes. Well, there you go. I think we basically agree. I think you just convinced yourself on that one, to be honest with you. But
I think Jean-Luc Picard did.
Yeah, well, I was drinking tea, so I feel like there was some subtle ways of making that point. Anders, thank you so much for coming on again to J Hutch Talks Too Much.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you come back again. But it was again a very productive conversation. I hope we have more like it. And do you want to give a plug to
if you're interested in film, as we say on our website, nuanced film discussion that avoids hot takes and is interested in substantial conversations about film. That's what we're trying to do over at threebrothersfilm.com, and check out our Three Brothers Filmcast this month. This episode, which just came out beginning of this week, it was on international art house films, Drive My Car, and A Hero, and Worst Person in the World. So something a little bit different. I think next month, we'll probably get back into the cineplex, the multiplex type stuff, because there's now a few movies coming up. But yeah, check it out, and you can follow me at AndersJB on Twitter as well.
Well, and I should say too, it is a kind of a perfect example of nuance, because you are, on the one hand, looking at a lot of pop cinema, not exclusively, I shouldn't say, but you don't look exclusively at it, but you do look at a lot of sort of pop cinema, but you don't talk about it in the way that people tend to talk about pop cinema, and I think that that's really instructive and helpful for people, because once again, I think people have these ways of putting films in these boxes, and you only talk about a Bergman or Fellini film, which I happen to like, but you happen to talk about, you talk about those movies in a particular way, and you talk about the Star Wars movies in a different way. And I think that you guys over there are doing something very different when it comes to looking at film, and I think that's
I hope so.
That's great.
I hope so.
Yeah. So yeah, I do encourage everybody to check that out, and love to hear your thoughts on this. And that's all. Thanks so much, Anders, once again. And thanks for everybody for watching. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.